You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. It's the end of the week. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You can go on over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio, and of course, all the different outlets where you can find this show. You can also go over to my YouTube channel and watch the video simulcast of this show. And the best part, of course, as we say every day, is the chat room, where all the other Intrepheads gather to watch the show and listen and talk amongst each other. I think you'll have a good time if you come over. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And while you're there, take advantage of scrolling down the main page, and you hit the Intrepid radio program section. I guess it's not really a link, it's the section. There's almost 200 shows in there. We're swiftly approaching our 200th episode in the next few days here, or the next week, something like that. I've got to go look at it again and find out. So come on over, subscribe. If you want to catch any of the past shows, you can find it on iTunes under the Intrepid radio program. You've got to use that whole name. Or you can come on over to my YouTube channel, watch the videos, and see the replay of all the chats. Now, you can't participate in the chats, as they're locked down when the show is archived, but you can see what people had to say and watch the video replay. So come on over, take advantage of that, subscribe, and click on the little bell, and you'll get alerted when all of these shows air in their original time slots. And thank you for being here today. It's Friday. It's the end of the week. We've been spending the better part of 2 weeks talking about Solomon. We started talking about, of course, Solomon, the temple, the Ring of Solomon, how this mythology, this mythological item, was it a real thing? It all depends on how you view the supernatural side of all of these characters that are found in biblical text. And so we started there. We went through the temple, talked about the alternative location of the temple. I think we pretty much concluded yesterday that the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock sits now, is the actual site of the old Temple of Solomon. Too much archaeological evidence exists, even though nobody has been able to come out and say, here is definitive proof that the temple stands here. There is a constant political play going on between Muslims and Jews over that piece of property. And where they have had some rare opportunities to get in and do some surface archaeological work, they found so much that really defines this site, that temple platform that you see in Jerusalem, as being the place where the old temple stood. And of course now there is a very long-standing monument for about 1,200 years. The Dome of the Rock has stood on that site. And so there is a constant political battle over the site. My opinion, these guys should all just come together and figure it out. If there was an ancient temple site, let that be promoted there. If there is the Dome of the Rock and a Muslim site, let that continue to be their site. But honor each other. And that's the biggest problem we have, is the ongoing age-old, millennial-old difference between both the Jews and, well, let's put it this way, the sons of Jacob and the sons of Esau. And you can go back in and look at the story of Jacob and Esau, which was really the beginning of the parting of ways between the Jews and the Arabs. And for lack of a more detail, that's kind of the etymology of it. That's where it all began. What's the word I'm looking for? The etiology. There you go. And so this is what we've covered so far to date. Now, I want to look at one last day, maybe, if we get it all in today, to talk about Solomon. And that is how Solomon became king. And is Solomon really the son of David? And to disrupt this family line, to say that he might not be the actual blood son of David, could disrupt the line of the prophetic line, which said that Jesus, the Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ, would come out of the seed of David, the line of David, because they trace Mary, the mother of Jesus, all the way back to King David. And this was something that, of course, after the time of David, was added to the mythology of the Messiah, that he must spring from the root of David. And so there might be some disruption here. You might disagree with some of this. It's pretty controversial stuff when you look at it this way, but we're going to look at the apologetic of the text that is written about David passing the kingdom on to Solomon, and how that happened, how that got there, and how Solomon became the king. And so put on your steel shorts, maybe your tinfoil hats a little bit. We're going to dig into this a bit. Now, we've talked about this before. Last summer, I did the whole series on David, but I thought this would be a great place to reprise this particular topic. And the place where we come in on the story of King David and passing the kingdom to his son, and of course all about Solomon's mom, Bathsheba. It really starts when we're examining the decline of King David in his reign as the king. Now, he has spent years consolidating his kingdom, conquering all the little kingdoms around Judah and Israel, which were two separate regions, coalesced them into one kingdom of Israel. And he conquered the city of David, which was the Jebusite city of Salem, which he then named Jerusalem. And that city still exists today, obviously. And the roots of David's final fall from grace can be traced to much earlier in his reign, to a time when he was at a height of considerable power, and it seemed that nothing could stand in his way. He was a warrior king, and nobody could defeat David, nobody could stand in his way. And he hardly could have foreseen the long-term consequences of his actions. But the end of his kingship over Israel began when he decided to take Bathsheba for his wife. There's going to be a little background on her. He had an affair with Bathsheba, and it's one of the most famous parts of David's story. His lust for her, his murder of her husband Uriah, his condemnation by Nathan the prophet, his realization of his guilt. The episode humanizes David in a way seldom seen elsewhere in the Bible narrative of his life. And the story is really a model of the biblical doctrine, theological doctrine, that sin must be followed by punishment and repentance. And even the great David made mistakes, and he suffered the consequences. Everyone can relate to this, and everybody could relate to his story in certain aspects. Take the king trappings out of it. And it's a story has had such an effect on readers over the centuries. But we saw in the case of the legendary battle that David had against Goliath, the giant, sometimes the most famous stories in antiquity are open for the most doubt. And I won't go through it today, but we did find that it's a possibility that David wasn't even the guy who slew Goliath, but it was one of his men who slew him. And we'll get into that another time, another day, and there's a whole episode I did on that if you want to look that up down in the archives. But where it says that David, they go through the whole episode of David slaying Goliath, there's another portion in a different book in the Old Testament, which lists the deeds of David and his men. And there was a guy named, it's not coming to me off the top of my head, one of his men in a list of deeds, of several deeds of different men that fought under David. He was the Bethlehemite, and I can't remember his name. It wasn't Ephraim, it was something like that he was the one who slew the giant. And it's a small mention in a different book. It's in the book of Chronicles. And so that's what I refer to when I speak of that. And we could talk about that again someday. But David and Bathsheba, this is a story that throughout the entire Davidic story in one of the books of the Bible, in the books of Samuel, we've seen that when the biblical authors go to great lengths to emphasize that something must be the case, we have reason to suspect exactly the opposite, and that there's an apologetic that is written here. And we saw this sort of emphasis in the claims that David was completely loyal to Saul, that David had no hand in the deaths of, I'm going to name some characters here, Nabal, Jonathan, Saul's son, Abner, Amnon, Absalom, Amasa, that all these guys who died during the reign of David, David was squeaky clean in them, but they all profited him somehow. And so there's an apologetic, I think, that was laid in place. And the literary clue in all of these instances is the attempt to establish the Bible's case as from as many angles as possible. In all of Saul's confrontations with David, we're told repeatedly that David is innocent and Saul's wrath is unjustified. For every death, not only is someone else to blame that is close to David, Joab, and an unnamed Amalekite, and even God himself, but David is always somewhere else when the death occurs. And the biblical authors want to leave nothing, absolutely zero to chance, to allow no room for misunderstanding. And ironically, it's their very insistence that for the superior reader, or suspicious reader, of biblical text, they don't want to leave any stone unturned that might undermine their case of building up who they want the public to believe who David was. And we find this is the same instance at work in the story of David's affair with Bathsheba. Now, in the Bathsheba story, the point to which the biblical authors want to lead us, and they do successfully and have successfully for centuries, is evident by how universally accepted the story has been over the millennia. And it's that Solomon was David's son. And to get us to this point, they tell the story of David seeing Bathsheba bathing from his rooftop and seeing her bathing in her courtyard of her house and lying with her, or having sex with her, and impregnating her. And he arranges for her husband, Uriah, to be killed in battle. And then he marries her. A child is born, but dies a few days later. Bathsheba becomes pregnant again, and this time she gives birth to David's son, Solomon. And so the biblical account begins with the notice that David witnessed Bathsheba bathing. And this isn't merely a bit of voyeuristic element thrown into the narrative. We're told that she had just purified herself after her menstrual period. 2 Samuel 11:4 states that. And so she wasn't merely bathing, she was undergoing the ritual bath to cleanse herself after menstruation, in accordance with Jewish law. And it was a common ancient Near Eastern practice, and the details of which you can find in the Levitical law. Leviticus 15, you can find this stuff. And so the key to understanding the import of this notice about what she is doing and the kind of bath that she's taking is that such purification took place approximately 7 days after a woman's period had ended. And in other words, when she would be at her most fertile. So this in turn makes inevitable the result of David sleeping with Bathsheba, where it says, "The woman conceived and she sent word to David, I am pregnant." And this was in 2 Samuel 11:5. And it makes you start to wonder, however, at how the biblical authors would have known this detail about Bathsheba's most private life. Women did not bathe only for the purpose of postmenstrual purification. And how would the authors know in the first place that David saw her while she was bathing, unless he related this account to them? And these details are unverifiable, but they're necessary for establishing Bathsheba's fertility at precisely the moment that David slept with her. That's the only reason she was taking a bath. It's the only reason they mentioned she was taking a bath of postmenstrual purification, to set the timeline solid that she is in her fertile, ovulating stage of her cycle. And so the Bible then tells us that David actually tried to extricate himself from this potentially embarrassing situation. He had Bathsheba's husband Uriah, one of David's army officers, sent back from the battle against Ammon, and where Joab and the military were besieging the Ammonite capital Rabbah, Joab being David's general, kind of his general-in-chief. And when Uriah was sent home, David had him brought back home, the husband of Bathsheba. He encouraged him to go spend some time at home to bathe his feet, a euphemism for sex. You've been fighting hard. Why don't you go home? You've been doing a good job. I'm going to reward you with a little leave and send you home to bathe your feet with that young wife of yours, Bathsheba. But what was Uriah's response? Despite David's repeated urgings to go home and have sex, you can imagine that. Here's Uriah. Why does the king keep pushing me to go have sex with my wife? Uriah, refused to go anywhere but to the military encampment near the palace. And this episode, too, suffers from an excess of seemingly private information. David's instructions to Uriah to go sleep with his wife, as well as Uriah's refusals, should, in theory, as well as Uriah's refusals, only have been known to David and to Uriah. So it reads like a fictional account, like a story that you'd read in a novel, instead of an historical account of these people. These details are needed, however, for the reader to appreciate the point of the story, that David wanted Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba so that Uriah would think himself to be the father of the child that Bathsheba was carrying because of David's affair with her. And so thus the Bible presents David as trying to preserve Uriah's honor, but failing. And the biblical story tells us that Uriah didn't go home. Instead, he went and he spent time in a very public place among the other military officers in front of the palace. And in this way, the authors announce that there were plenty of witnesses who could testify to the fact that Uriah never went home, and the child, therefore, could not be his. And of course, Uriah didn't know his wife was pregnant at this point. And remember some of his response to David: how can I go home and have sex with my wife and spend time in bed with my wife when my other soldiers are here as well? He was a loyal captain, is what they were trying to paint the picture of Uriah. So here as elsewhere, the biblical authors were trying to put a particular spin on an event for which the basic facts are in dispute, or are not in dispute. In this case, the facts are Bathsheba was once Uriah's wife, she was now David's wife, and that she bore a son who, though no one knew it yet, would one day become David's successor to the throne, Solomon. And so this is what they're writing at the time where David was already now, afterwards, married to Bathsheba. So this is the essence of the biblical narrative, but it's been overlaid with details that betray their non-historical origins. As with other episodes from David's life, the aspects that are invented by the biblical authors are identifiable both by the insistence on a particular interpretation and the introduction of unverifiable private moments. This creates an apologetic. They're setting up a story to really make David look better. and to give you details of a story that should never have been known to the public. And these two features are present in almost every verse of the story that you can examine about David and Bathsheba and their affair. And whatever the underlying truth may be, and we're going to get to that, because I believe it's there, the biblical story appears to be a literary creation. Now, something happened between these three people, but it's not what they're insisting in the pages of Scripture. So, as the story continues, Uriah returned to the battlefront. David took the pregnant Bathsheba into his harem. And this meant that when Uriah came home from battle, he would find that his wife suddenly belonged to another man. So David knew only one solution to most of life's problems, and it was the obvious choice here as well, and something David was very accustomed to doing. Uriah had to die. And so the Bible presents David's decision to have Uriah killed as the result of Uriah's refusal to sleep with Bathsheba. And as if it were the only option left to David. This is all he could do, was have him killed. He couldn't just confess, I had sex with your wife, I'm the king, you got to deal with it. He had to have him killed. But the two don't logically follow. The authors had already established beyond a doubt that Bathsheba's baby was David's child. What difference then did it make now if Uriah lived or died? The biblical author said, this is Bathsheba's kid. He's going to grow up in the palace. Uriah's going to find out eventually. Does it matter if he lived or died? Because he had to die so the story wouldn't get out. And so they could make it known that it was David's legitimate child. And so we understand this from the prophet Nathan's famous encounter with David. The prophet Nathan, he approaches David and he recounts, he says, I have this matter that I need the king's judgment on. And David says, go ahead, tell me what you've got. And he said, there was a rich man who took a poor man's only lamb, even though the rich man had so many of his own. The poor man had nothing but this one ewe lamb, and he loved it. He even slept in the bed with him. And he was so close to it. It was like somebody's dog, you know, the way they have dogs, and your dog sleeps with you, and so on. And the rich man took that lamb instead of one of his thousands of sheep, took the poor man's ewe lamb and slaughtered it for a feast. And David, when he hears the story, is really pissed off by this story because the rich man's committed this great wrong. And Nathan then retorts, points his finger at David with dramatic accusation, and he says, thou art the man. You're the guy. You're the rich guy. And that's in 2 Samuel 12:7. And David's crime is spelled out for him. You've put Uriah the Hittite to the sword. You took his wife. You made her your wife. And there's nothing here about the baby in Bathsheba's womb, by the way. So we may imagine that Uriah's death happened in a manner quite close to its biblical depiction. Nathan is accusing David of adultery, not of creating a child. The child's not even mentioned when Nathan approaches David. So according to the story, David sent Joab, his general, a message telling him to have Uriah placed in the front lines in heavy fighting and then have the troops around Uriah fall back to leave him standing alone where he was sure to be killed. And Joab didn't quite follow David's instructions to the letter, perhaps because he realized just how obvious such a play would be. Instead, he sent Uriah and a number of others to a particularly well-defended area of the besieged city where they were fighting, where many of them, including Uriah, were killed. And David's response to the news puts into words the low value he placed on the lives of others, even to his most loyal officers. David said, don't be upset about the matter. The sword consumes all equally. That's in 2 Samuel 11:25. In other words, David is happy to sacrifice a number of his best men to ensure that he'll have a clear path to taking the woman of his choice, the wife of Uriah. And everything about this seems realistic enough with one exception. The Bible tells us that the message instructing Joab to have Uriah killed was delivered, sealed, by the hands of Uriah himself. David gives him the message and he hands it to Joab. And David wrote this letter to Joab, which he sent to Uriah. And this claim is necessary because the authors have just had David bring Uriah to Jerusalem to sleep with his wife. If that story was invented, so too the notion that Uriah was the one to deliver his own death warrant to the general. And the elimination of this feature does little to soften the cruelty that David exhibited in this matter. A man died for David's lust. And in fact, many men died, thinking that they were fighting for their king, but they were merely dying for him. And that's the end of this first segment. We got to go out to break. Sit tight. We'll be right back. All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You can also come over and watch the simulcast. Join the live chat right now going on live during this show over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Let's jump right back into this because I have so much material and I have a feeling we're not going to get through it. So we just talked about David's affair with Bathsheba, her telling him she was pregnant, the prophet coming and telling, David sending Uriah back to the front, bringing him home to sleep with his wife to cover the pregnancy. Uriah being such a loyal soldier, he wouldn't go sleep with his wife when the rest of his men couldn't do the same thing, so he stayed the night in the encampment. David sends him back, sends a message, a sealed message to the general, saying, put Uriah in the front of the battle, have him killed. Joab sends a bunch of men up to the front instead of just Uriah, so it didn't look so obvious. Bunch of guys die, fighting for their king. And David brushes it off as everyone dies by the sword, eventually. And so the biblical story took on this surprising twist at the end of Nathan's oracle, the prophet's oracle to David. Not only will David be punished for his sins by experiencing Absalom's revolt. Remember, just before this whole scene, well, maybe you don't remember, David's own son Absalom had revolted, and David crushed the revolt, and his general killed his son, Absalom, his favorite son. That's what happened just before all of this. And so we saw in the previous story about Absalom that he was killed, but the child about to be born to him, to David and Bathsheba, is now, according to the prophet Nathan, also going to die. God's not going to allow this child to live. And the story of the infant's death is famous. It's moving. David fasts and prays for 7 days that the child would live, but stops once the baby has died, much to his servant's confusion. And his explanation is authentically touching. David says, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, because I thought, who knows, Yahweh may have mercy on me, and the child may live. But now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will never come back to me." And that was 2 Samuel 12. And it's a recognizably parental scene, and one that still resonates as realistic today, but we have grown accustomed by now to David's public displays of grief over Saul, the former king, his son Jonathan, over Abner, over Absalom. And now we've come, remember when Absalom dies, there's this scene where, and it's truly moving, where David, I think of my own sons, and his son led a rebellion against his dad. He didn't hate his father. He thought he'd be the better king. And he's killed, of course. And David, he says, "Oh, Absalom." He says, "Absalom, my son, Absalom, would that I had died in your place." And he grieved and kept grieving that his advisors thought he was done. And so the story, as it goes now, the death of the firstborn son is followed immediately in the Bible by the birth of a second son to David and Bathsheba. And it turns out that this is Solomon. And the story of the death of David and Bathsheba's firstborn son is, to put it gently, bizarre. It's odd that the child was given no name. It was the custom to name a newborn immediately after birth, as we see in virtually every birth narrative in the Bible. Names held great importance in the ancient world. They defined one's relationship to kin or to the deity, and they often reflected the manner of the child's birth. The naming of Jacob's sons in Genesis is a good example. A nameless child would be an anomaly. So that's an anomaly right away. They didn't name the child. Second, Nathan's prophetic announcement of the infant's imminent death entails a logical inconsistency. When David repents for taking Bathsheba and having Uriah killed, we're told Nathan responds, "Yahweh has removed your punishment. You shall not die. However, since you've spurned Yahweh by his death, the child about to be born to you shall die." That's in 2 Samuel 12. And Nathan implies that the punishment for David's sin will be inflicted upon the unborn child. Yet nowhere in the preceding oracle predicting Absalom's rebellion is it ever said that David would die for his sins there. And this, I always thought it was interesting that you see in biblical Christianity the big stand against abortion and things like that. Yet God was willing to end a child's life for the sins of his father. It's interesting. Now, third and most important, the death of the firstborn child renders the lengthy preceding account of its conception absolutely moot. If the firstborn son was to die, then why go to all the bother making it clear that it was David's child? All of the demonstrations that David must be the father, Bathsheba's purification, Uriah's refusal to sleep with his wife, end up being a false lead, kind of a blind motif that's leading you by the nose in one direction, which makes it very literary invention, an invention of literary, a literary invention. That's what I'm trying to say. What difference does it make in the end if the baby is Uriah's or David's? The child has no effect on the larger story. Once Solomon is the second son born, long after Uriah's death, and his paternity therefore established beyond a doubt, the first child's paternity is a non-issue. And so the biblical authors don't waste words. If they wanted to make clear that David and Bathsheba's firstborn son was really David's child, they must have had a reason to do so. When we read the narrative, we expect that this unborn child will be of great importance just from the amount of space the Bible devotes to the story of its conception, and the proof of its paternity. And stories like these are reserved for major figures. Even David himself doesn't have a birth story like this. And so the sudden death of this child renders the efforts of the biblical authors for naught. And all of this has led many scholars correctly to the conclusion that the account of the death of David and Bathsheba's firstborn child, beginning with the last words of Nathan's oracle to him, is a later insertion into the original story. And it might be a... I'm wondering about this note I have here. Yeah, you can look into things like Timo Viello, Solomon, Bathsheba's firstborn, in his book Reconsidering Israel and Judah, and recent studies. If you want to dig into some of the scholarship on this and the way scholars think about it, so it might be a successful representation of parental grief, but it fails on almost every other level. If it is excised, then Solomon is the first and only child that Bathsheba bore in David's house. And all of the arguments for David's paternity of the firstborn son then make much more sense. Now they are arguments for Solomon being David's son. And it's clear enough why it would be important for the biblical authors to establish this fact with this lengthy story about the firstborn son. Solomon followed David on the throne. And if he were not really David's son, if there was any possibility that he was Uriah's son because of the overlap, the affair, and so on, if he were actually not the rightful heir, with all the natural rights that come with standard royal succession, he would be a usurper, and the legitimacy of his reign would be therefore undermined. So the biblical authors had to set a story in place that showed that there was a child that died, and then David and Bathsheba, once married, legitimately bore a son, Solomon. But why would the biblical authors feel the need to make this case? None of David's other sons are provided with detailed proofs of paternity. He had 7 sons. I think it was 7. And there was no detailed case made for them. And no one would ever have questioned them. Someone must have thought that Solomon was in fact not David's son. And it's to this charge that the Bible responds. So here is Solomon, the great king, who succeeds his father David on the throne. They have to insert this lengthy account of his birth and his legitimate birth, legitimately David impregnating Bathsheba, and leaving no question that Uriah was the possible father. They had to establish this case because someone, and there must have been scuttlebutt going around that Solomon wasn't actually the son of David. And it's to this charge that the Bible responds with this story. So why would Solomon's descent from David be in question at all? And the most significant issue is Solomon's name. It was the custom in Israel for the mother to name her children. And we see this, for example, in the naming of Jacob's 12 sons by their mothers, Leah and Rachel. Bathsheba, therefore, was the one to name her son Solomon. And the child was born, as the Bible admits, after Uriah's death in Ammon, where they were fighting, to which we'll return to this in a minute. And it's telling us that Bathsheba should name her newborn son Solomon, which means his replacement. That's what the name means. Bathsheba gives her son a name that memorializes her deceased husband. If David were the father, this would be problematic. In the first place, we would expect David's son to be named after him, if anyone. And beyond this, we might wonder what David would make of his son being named in honor of Bathsheba's first husband. Such a name would practically announce to the world that Bathsheba's affection still belonged to Uriah. And it may have been the mother's right to name her child, but it's hard to imagine David's allowing Uriah's memory to live on in David's son. So it's the discomfort that such a situation produces that probably led to Solomon being given a second name in the Bible, Jedediah. So Solomon is also Jedediah. Perhaps lost in translation is the wordplay inherent in this name. Jedediah means beloved of Yahweh. It's etymologically, there you go, linked to David, beloved. And the second name for Solomon, which is never used again in the royal line, is at an attempt to erase the connection to Uriah and replace it with a connection to David. So there's another reason to suspect that Solomon wasn't really David's son. Bathsheba was not merely a random, beautiful woman. She was the daughter of Eliam, one of David's warriors. And Eliam, in turn, was the son of Ahithophel, the same Ahithophel who defected from David during Absalom's rebellion. So Bathsheba's grandfather was an advisor to Absalom, and when David's son Absalom rebelled, Ahithophel went with him. And so Solomon was Ahithophel's great-grandson. So if Ahithophel thought that his great-grandson stood in line for the succession to the throne, he hardly would have supported Absalom, which would all but guarantee that Ahithophel's offspring would never attain the kingship. So Ahithophel would defect to Absalom only if he had no reason to think that Solomon might someday be the king. And because Solomon was not one of David's offspring, would be the thinking. So the biblical authors tried their best to disguise Solomon's true father. They created a scenario in which Bathsheba is virtually obligated by biology to become pregnant by David. She's in her most fertile stage when David sees her bathing naked on her back patio. And the biblical authors try to disguise that Solomon is David's son. They created a story in which David acts on the assumption that he is Solomon's father, and in which Uriah acts in a way that publicly ensures this to be the case, but the authors could not overcome two unchangeable facts: Solomon's name and Bathsheba's genealogy. Both of these testify to Solomon's being Uriah's son, not David's. Now remember, you've got to place your mind in the ancient world, in the context of ancient rulers, to start letting this seep in a little bit. Don't use 21st century justifications or understandings in this story. No matter what stories the authors invented, Solomon's name still identified him as Uriah's son. And it's safe to say, given the Bible's detailed rendering of an alternative scenario, that there were those in Israel in David's day who recognized this fact. Solomon ain't David's son. That's Uriah's kid. I wonder what he looked like. I wonder if he looked like Uriah. That'd be interesting as he grew up. But the story of the death of the firstborn son of David and Bathsheba was a creation, a literary creation, inserted to address this lingering problem. Not only does the story make it chronologically impossible for Solomon to be Uriah's son, but it provides quite cleverly a new explanation for Solomon's name. Now he could be seen as the replacement, not for Uriah, but for his ill-fated older sibling Absalom. And so this sort of naming is known from the Bible and elsewhere in the Near East. And in Genesis 4, Eve gives her third son. Remember? Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Eve has a third son, names him Seth, meaning God has provided me with another offspring in place of my son Abel. And who had died at the hands of Cain? And the 8th century BCE Assyrian king Sennacherib, famous for his attacks on Judah during the reign of King Hezekiah, bears a name meaning sin, a Mesopotamian deity, that has replaced brothers for me. And so the biblical authors provided this alternative referent for Solomon's name, and thereby removed the last potential link between Solomon and Uriah. And they did so, however, at the cost of narrative logic. And in the compounding of the Bible's insistence that Solomon, despite his name, could not be Uriah's son, these authors led us only one more step closer to the firm conclusion that Solomon was actually indeed Uriah's son. And the biblical authors present David and Bathsheba's affair as the story of their children. The reality is that the affair, just like any other, it was about sex. And the Bible's presentation of Bathsheba as unknown to David is probably false. David knew who Bathsheba was. It says that he didn't know her. He had to ask, who's this woman out there? Who is she? Bring her to me. I want to meet her. Now, most likely, David had already known her and had his eye on her for nearly his entire life. She was, after all, the wife of one of his chosen warriors, the daughter of one of his chosen warriors, and the granddaughter of his trusted personal advisor. David was always one to take what he wanted. You look at the whole story, the whole narrative of David. David was an ass. David was a bastard. David was a bloody warrior. David took what he wanted. Every story you read of David, where there's an apologetic put in, he's always the man after God's heart. He took what he wanted, if not by the sword, by some other devious event. And people died around David. David was probably not, as we concluded in the series I did on David, probably not somebody we would have liked today. He's probably not a likable person. And the biblical authors had to write an apologetic about him to make him likable as the first anointed, well, actually the second anointed king of Israel, but the king from whom the Messiah would someday sprout. David was always one to take what he wanted, regardless of the claims of others. And this is especially true of women. Remember Ahinoam? She was the wife of King Saul, and David had sex with her and took her to his wife when he fled from the presence of Saul. This is why Saul wanted to kill David. David was somebody that tried to sleep his way to the top, to show that, and that was something, if you could take the king's wife, you were showing the king was weak, and this is what David did to Saul by taking his wife Ahinoam. That's a whole nother story, and we talked about that in the past. But there was Ahinoam, there was Abigail, the wife of Nabal, the fool, the rich man who denied David tribute, and Michal, the daughter of Saul. All three of these women could contest and attest, that David took what he wanted. And we might imagine that with the army and with Uriah engaged in a lengthy siege abroad, David saw the opportunity to take for himself the beautiful Bathsheba, whom he had probably long coveted. It's subjective, but it makes sense in the story. And it was undoubtedly a surprise to discover that she was already pregnant with Uriah's child. But this would have been little more than a passing disappointment. After all, he had little invested in the baby, who wasn't even his own. And Bathsheba would enter David's harem as one of his many wives and concubines, and the child would become whatever he would become. It was, so David thought, none of his concern. Solomon had no deceased older brother. He was the first child to Bathsheba after David took her into his harem, but he was not David's son. He was Uriah's son. And the Bible's attempts to persuade us otherwise are part of the standard biblical genre of apologetic. But this isn't an apology for David, it's an apology for Solomon. Solomon, who would become king after David, in David's place as the son of David. But he had no right to the throne because he was the son of Uriah. So just as pro-David authors created an apology for how David came to reign in the place of Saul, the king before him, so too pro-Solomon authors had to create an apology for how Solomon came to reign in the place of David. And how this actually happened, we're going to go through a little bit with what little time we have left here. The Bible very much wants us to think that it was a natural succession, the son following the father. But it was anything but. And there is another son who comes into play here, Adonijah. The story of Solomon's succession to the throne, the next time we hear of Solomon after his birth, comes naturally at the end of David's life. And after all his battles against Israel's enemies, against Israel itself, and his own son, David was old and tired. His body, which had carried him to so many victories, had finally broken down. Imagine the body and the state, the physical state, an old warrior would be, and who had done nothing but be a warrior his entire life. It says they covered him with bedclothes, but he wasn't warmed. In 1 Kings 1, it tells us that. Even the notion that David needed others to put blankets on him testifies to his physical decline. His courtiers tried to comfort him with the company of a beautiful young girl named Abishag. And there's some irony in this. The man who had used so many women for his own ends now required a woman merely to keep him warm. They would put her naked in his bed just to keep him warm at night. Maybe during the day as well. We used to joke around in Bible college, I need an Abishag to keep me warm. So Rainey is my Abishag, although I'm not old and broken down quite yet. So there's some irony in this when you see that David, who was a user of women, a lustful man, took so many women that he needed a woman to be given to him to keep him warm. There's no depiction of David's decline that can be more pointed than this. His virility had absolutely abandoned him. And although the Bible makes no mention of it, it's only natural to wonder not only about David's physical health, but about his mental health as well. The Bible's silence is probably meant to suggest that David was still mentally sound, but the course of events would suggest otherwise. After Absalom's death, the next in line for the throne was David's fourth son, Adonijah. And he had only to wait for David to die and he'd become king. Yet for Adonijah, as for Absalom before him, waiting was unacceptable. He saw the state his dad was in, and he declared his intention to make himself king in both words and actions. And he provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. That's in 1 Kings 1. This is kind of what Absalom did when he led his revolt. And this is precisely what Absalom had done, and with the same intentions. To make the comparison even clearer, the biblical authors tell us that Adonijah was very handsome. He was born after Absalom. Knowing that Solomon will be one to succeed David, we can recognize all of this as foreshadowing. Adonijah will be more like Absalom than he might prefer. And so as with Absalom, David doesn't prevent any of this. But this time, it's not because Adonijah lives elsewhere or is preparing a coup in secret. Yet David did nothing. Everything Adonijah did was out in the open. And Adonijah, and I'm seeing we're almost out of time here, so I got to wrap this up. Adonijah is killed at the altar of the temple, or the tabernacle. Wasn't a temple yet till Solomon built it. And so he threw a feast and all this plotting, and David wasn't part of it, and he ends up getting killed. Adonijah's opponent. And we remember Solomon, who he really was. He was a relative nobody, not a son of David, and the lack of an invitation was understood. Adonijah didn't invite Solomon to his feast. And the Bible makes Adonijah out to be committing a coup. Self-promotion, so on. And the fact that so much of the royal house supported Adonijah and his coup suggests it was common knowledge that David's rule for all practical purposes had come to an end. But then there is a request made by Bathsheba, which is the most important part of Solomon coming to the throne, and we're out of time. We can't hit it tonight. We'll try to hit this on Monday and wrap up Solomon's mom. So be here on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific Time for It's Sunday. Other than that, you guys have a good weekend, and we'll see you on Sunday morning.